In the spring of 2013, I went to church on a Sunday night, the same thing I did every week because I had to catch a flight on Monday mornings. I worked out of town and lived out of airports and hotels. I was going to take the same flight, same gate. The Uber picked me up at the same time, and that night on Sunday night, I looked across the room as the preacher was giving the message, and I saw one of my friends on the other side of the room that I hadn't seen forever. And so instead of bolting out the door after church, I went to talk with my friend. And as I was talking with him, he saw a friend across the room that he knew, and he called her over and introduced us. And this girl really caught my eye, but I had to catch a flight the next morning, and I wasn't really looking to date anybody, and I kind of found out she wasn't either, but we exchanged contact info, and we started talking during the week, and a couple weeks go by, and I just say, okay, I can't get this girl off of my mind. I've got to get together with her, so I flipped open my phone. I was late to the smartphone game, and I started to type out this text message. Anybody remember this? And it's taken me like 5-10 minutes, and there's this coffee shop that I hadn't been to in ages. It's nothing unique or famous. I just decided I really wanted to meet her at this coffee shop, and so I'm nervously typing out this text message, trying to fumble through my words and get all the buttons to work correctly to type this really unique name. And during that, a text message pops up on my phone from her, and she said, "Hey, I'm going to this coffee shop." And it was the exact one that I was trying to spell into my phone. And she said, "I'm going to be there in like 30 minutes. Do you want to meet there for coffee?" What a coincidence. And so I quickly deleted that message, and I said, "I'll be there in 10." And I remember driving over to this coffee shop. I was like looking in the rearview mirror. I thought I was being pranked. I was looking for cameras in my car. I thought like Jesus might show up and turn up in the passenger seat. But I got to that date, and turns out for both of us, it was our last first date because that girl was Lindsay, and this year we're celebrating being married for 10 years. What a coincidence. Have you ever had a time in your life where you just knew without a shadow of a doubt that wasn't just a coincidence? God is involved in my life. Like how you got the job, or how you showed up in Minneapolis, or how you met the person, or how you were the one to get the apartment or the house. Like you just knew. That can't just be random. There is a God, and He is up to something in my life. I mean, you could feel like me, and I was full of faith. And in that moment, I was like, God is right here. Like He is guiding every decision of my life to come to this. And I'd love to tell you that just comes with the job description of being a pastor, and you think like, oh man, Trent, that's like every moment of your life. God's always there. Man, if I'm honest, that's like the minority of the moments. Why does it more feel like probably the experience that you have and I have where it's like, where is God? It's like God's gone missing. Some of you are like, where's my divine text message to meet my spouse? I've been waiting for years for that, but Pastor, I'd love to have that kind of testimony. Or like, where's me landing the job when all I face is unemployment? Or where's me coming into blessing when all I'm facing is poverty? And why is it that following Jesus in faith can feel more like asking God, where are you? And why are you missing? And why aren't you answering my prayers than the moments where He kind of divinely shows up? The answer, it actually has something to do, and everything to do, with Christmas. I want to give a message today. I've given the title to Christmas in Persia. We're in this series called I'll Be Home for Christmas, where if you've been here, you know, and if you're new, let me catch you up. We're looking at stories from people who are associated with the Christmas story, and they all have something in common. They found themselves really, really far away from home and in some undesirable situations and places. It's like they left the front door of home, and they really want to figure out, how do I get back home? And if there's anybody who asked the question, where is God? And why is God so missing from my story? Their names are Mordecai and Esther. I want to look at the book of Esther today, and I think for some of you, you maybe have heard of Esther, but you don't know the story of Esther. I think for most of us, Esther's not the last book of the Bible you recently studied, so I want to tell you the story, and then let's talk about what it means and what in the world it has to do with Christmas. Let me give you some context as I tell this story. It's 500 years before Christmas. And all of the Jews found themselves really far away from the front door of their home. They're in exile right now. They're in Babylon. And then Babylon was conquered by Persia. They're celebrating Christmas in Persia. If you were here this fall, let me just give you a little bit more accurate placement. This is going to happen right before the book of Nehemiah. See, Ruth and Boaz, as we talked about last weekend, that was like a bright spot in the Christmas story, but things kind of kept tumbling out of control because of the wickedness and the sin in the world, and eventually God had to punish his people, so he put them in like this divine timeout all the way over in Babylon, but he said, after 70 years, I'm bringing you out of timeout, and I'm going to bring you back home. And so he starts bringing these remnants of people back to Jerusalem to rebuild and reestablish worship. You recognize people like Zerubbabel led one of those remnants. Ezra led a remnant. Nehemiah led a remnant. But Mordecai and Esther, instead of being in the remnants that are going back to the city of Jerusalem, they are stuck in Persia. Like really stuck. Let me tell you how the story starts. It says, at that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa, it's a city in Persia. And in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all of his nobles and officials. And for a full 180 days, he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor of his glory of his majesty. And when these days were over, the king gave a banquet lasting for 7 days. You want to know what Persia's like? Xerxes throws a 6-month party ending with a 7-day, 24/7 rager. Welcome to Persia, where what the king says goes. There is no morality. It is as pagan as you can possibly get. And on the last day of this drunken 6-month party, Xerxes has the idea and goes up to his wife Vashti and says, you know what you got to do? You got to come before all the men and parade your beauty in front of them. He's looking at his bros. He's like, look at how beautiful my wife is. And Vashti's like, no, I'm not going to do that. And he looks to his bros. His bros are like, we can't have that happen. No one says no to the king. So Xerxes says, well, I'm done with her. I'm putting this lightly for the kids in the room. And the bros say, well, here's what you got to do, Xerxes. You can't just have no queen. We got to have a beauty pageant. And we'll find the most beautiful women from the whole land, and we'll do like the Persian bachelorette. And Xerxes goes to his bros, and he's like, you guys are absolutely brilliant. We're doing that. That's the kind of king this guy was. So they go searching for all the women of the land. And that's where we meet Mordecai. And that's where we meet Esther, in the middle of that messed up plan by Xerxes. It says, now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew from the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, who had a cousin named Esther, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. She's an orphan. The young woman had a lovely figure and was beautiful, and Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and her mother died. When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Haggai. Esther also was taken to the king's palace. Esther had not revealed her nationality and her family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. And every day Mordecai, he walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. Now, real talk, can you imagine how far from home Esther felt? I mean, she's an orphan of her family. Her uncle adopts her to be his own daughter, and then she gets taken into this wicked plan of Xerxes, and now she's in the palace, separated by the gates, and Mordecai is just forced to stay outside the front door. She's not going back to Israel with the remnant. She's stuck in Persia. She's a victim of Xerxes, and she has to hide her Jewish identity. Mordecai says, whatever you do, just don't tell them you're a Hebrew. Don't tell them you're Jewish right now. And this orphan who had been adopted is now separated from her adopted family as well. Well, a year go by, and Xerxes says, hey, it's time for the beauty pageant. Bring out all the women we have found from these thousands of nationalities that we just conquered throughout the whole known world, and I will pick out a wife. And it says, now the king was attracted to Esther more than any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other women. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. What a rags to riches story. I mean, Disney princesses got nothing on Esther. She becomes queen of the most powerful government of the entire land. I mean, things are looking up in Persia for Mordecai and for Esther. And it's so interesting. Mordecai, remember what he was doing? He was always outside the front door of the palace, waiting to talk to Esther, his heart broken. It says, during that time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, they became angry at Xerxes, and they conspired to assassinate him. But Mordecai, because he happened to be sitting outside, hears about the plan, and he found out the plot, and he told Esther, Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. I mean, just so happened he was sitting outside the gate doing what he did every single day, waiting to talk, see if he'd get a glimpse of Esther. And then these two guys are talking, and they're kind of mad at Xerxes, and they say, well, we're going to kill him. Mordecai says, well, let's not do that. Esther, go tell Xerxes there's an assassination plot. She does, and Mordecai saves the day. Now, if you're Mordecai, come on, what would you be thinking at that point? God has delivered me. I'm finally going to get a job inside of the palace. I did the right thing. I saved Xerxes. Things are looking up in Persia. God must be up to something. And then one of the saddest verses of the whole Bible says, after these events, King Xerxes honored, not Mordecai, Haman, the Agagite. Haman, who's that? It says elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than that of all the other nobles. And all the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman. For the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai is a good Hebrew. He wouldn't bow down to any human leaders because he only bowed his knee to Yahweh, to God. I mean, can you imagine Mordecai right now? Maybe you have something to relate with him. The best day of your life. I just saved the king. Blessing is coming. To the worst news he had ever received. Not only is blessing not coming, but somebody who's asking you to disobey God is now over you. And Haman, when he went up to Mordecai and Mordecai wouldn't bow, he got really upset with Mordecai. So Haman was friends with Xerxes, and so he goes up to Xerxes and says, hey, Xerxes, I know we've kind of conquered all these people, and there's thousands of other nations. You need to know that there's one nation who is really unruly. They will not bow to you. It's like, he's way exaggerating. It's like all the people, and here's what I'll do, because Haman was very wealthy. He said, I will pay you billions of dollars. I'll give you all my wealth if you will let me exterminate all of those people. And Xerxes is like, whoa, that's intense. Like, you can keep your money. I'm Xerxes. I got all the money in the world. But if there's an unruly people group, there's thousands of them. Just take care of it. I trust you. You're my bro. Exterminate whoever you want. And Haman says, great. I'll take you up on that. So he sends an edict out and says, I'm starting with Mordecai, but anybody who's a Hebrew, I am going to wipe you off of the face of this planet. And he goes up to Xerxes, and he says, let's do this. This will be fun. Let's leave it up to chance. And so he casts lots. It's like ancient dice. He takes the dice, and he throws them in front of Xerxes, and they land on some coincidental numbers. The 13th day of the month of Adar. 11 months from now, that's when the execution and the extermination is going to come to all the Hebrews, all the Jews. So the word goes out. It starts with Mordecai. Esther hears about it. goes out to the Jewish people all throughout the land, and they hear about it. And of course, there's weeping and there's wailing throughout the land. I mean, wouldn't you, if you figured out you are part of an extermination plan and you've got 11 months left and you're in exile? I mean, I might start thinking like maybe God wasn't done with punishing us in 70 years. I mean, after all, we were sinful. We ended up in exile. Maybe God's not done. Maybe he's not done punishing us. Mordecai hears about it. And he just happened to see Esther outside. He goes and he talks to Esther. He says, Esther, Xerxes picked you. Xerxes loves you. You've got to do something about this. You've got to talk to Xerxes. I mean, isn't that just amazing coincidence? Esther is inside the palace. She's queen. And Esther responds. She says, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned has but one law. They be put to death unless the king extends a gold scepter to them and spares their lives. You approach the king, it's the death penalty unless he chooses to have mercy. But here's the bad thing, Mordecai. I just saw him. She says, 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. Oof, you talk about bad timing. Like she had just seen Xerxes. If it just would have, man, if God just would have known that 30 days prior, I mean, he just totally missed the timing. Mordecai, like I can't go back to him. Now it's hard for us to understand the gravity of this situation. So let me try to explain it the best way I can. You know the scene in the movies, like the action movies, where there's one person who has this world-saving information and nobody believes them and nobody knows about it, but if they can just go tell the president, if they can just tell the leader of that nation, then maybe, just maybe, the world will be saved, but they don't know. And they know that when they go try to approach them, they're going to die. Like you try to make your way through the security, you're going to die. You may only have 15 seconds left to live and get 2 breaths out, but maybe, just maybe in those 2 breaths, you could tell the leader some information to save the world. That's Esther. She says, it's the death penalty. And Mordecai, hearing that she had just been in there for 30 days, he responds like this. This is interesting. Look at this. He says, when Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Don't think that just because you're in the king's house, that you of all the Jews are going to escape this. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. He says this, I love it. Who knows? Who knows? But that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Now let me pause, because we got to talk about this, because this is so interesting. How in the world does Mordecai, looking at everything that has happened and everything going around him, how does he respond with the urgency like it all depends on them? Yet with the confidence that if they don't do it, God will still somehow save the Jews from being wiped off the face of the planet. How does Mordecai do that? Well, here's the thing you didn't know about Mordecai. Mordecai knew his Bible. Mordecai must have known his Torah. Mordecai knew that there was a bigger plan in place, maybe than what he could see right before him. Mordecai knew about this really big theological word I want to teach you about today. Mordecai knew the proto-evangelium. You say the proto, what? The proto-evangelium. It's the word that means the setup. It means the good news before it happened. Mordecai knew that there was this promise that had been in place. Mordecai knew that there was a bigger story that was at play here. It's been called the most important verse of the whole Bible, because without understanding what this verse is, you'll miss out on the whole storyline of the Bible and what it's getting at. See, the sin and the moral wreck that we see in this story is all because of the original sin and just continued to spin and grow out of control in the world. Yet when people sinned, Adam and Eve in the garden, God said some things after they sinned. There would be some consequences on the human side, but he also said this to the serpent, to Satan. It says this in Genesis 3:15. So the Lord God said to the serpent, because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and all wild animals. You will crawl on your belly, you will eat dust all the days of your life, and I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and hers. And then he says this, the proto-evangelium. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. You say, what does that mean? Let me give you a translation. There's going to come a Messiah through the seed of mankind, through humans. And that Messiah is going to save us from the sting of death of sin. But the way he's going to do it, no one's going to expect. He's going to get stung himself. But what's going to look like death is only going to be a bruise to him. We've been talking about in this series, we see this, the proto-evangelium, develop. That it's coming through a family led by Abraham, who had sons and had grandsons. Two of them were Joseph and Judah that we talked about. There's other people in that line. That this Messiah was going to be Jewish. Let me connect the dots. No Jews, no Christmas. If you exterminate all the Jews, Christmas is canceled. That's the point. You take all of them out, you will stop Christmas. Christmas will never come. And Mordecai would have known this. Mordecai had seen Satan's attempts to do this before. Mordecai would have known about a pharaoh in Egypt who made this edict. When the Jews were overpopulating and growing, this pharaoh said, we need to kill all of the male babies, except one escaped. His name was Moses. It says that Moses was hidden. And Moses actually went to deliver the people from Pharaoh in Egypt. Mordecai would have known only a few centuries prior, 2 Kings 11, when there was this wicked person named Athaliah who decided that in the line of David, I am going to kill every male heir in that family. I'm wiping out the possibility of Christmas and a Messiah, except one. Someone named Joash. He was hidden by people, and the promise stayed in play. Mordecai had this sense. He must have known that his story might be colliding with the cosmic story of Christmas. And he decided, I'm going to choose to trust that the promise is still in play. And who knows, Esther? Who knows? What feels so hidden right now? When it feels like God is so missing right now? Maybe this is God's way of breaking into the story. Maybe this is God's way of crushing the head of the serpent. And so Esther says, I think you're right. Remember, Esther was raised by Mordecai. She says, I'll talk to Xerxes, even though it means the end of my life. I would rather live for God and see if I'm part of his plan. So to make a long story short, Xerxes meets Esther and extends that spear pole to her, that golden scepter, and she's spared. It says, Esther, you're amazing. You're my favorite. What do you want? And she says, well, let me do what you love. I'm going to plan you a party in the morning. And Xerxes is like, yes, I love parties. This will be great. Thank you for planning me a party. She says, here, do one thing. Invite Haman to the party. He says, great. I love Haman too. This is going to be really great. Now, unknowing to that, Haman had planned that next day to kill Mordecai. He had already set up the weapon to kill him on a pole. And Haman was planning on going that next morning to Xerxes just to make sure he had the blessing, because that's when the real party would start for Haman and the extermination of the Jews would begin. But Xerxes that night had some insomnia, and he couldn't sleep. I don't know if this was common for him, but, that night he couldn't sleep. And so he ordered his servants to bring in the most boring thing he could possibly have read to him and say, just put me to sleep. Bring the Chronicles. Bring the daily newspapers from across the land. Read them to me, and I'll get some sleep tonight. So his servants come in. They read him some of these newspapers, and they just happened to pick this one newspaper and started reading and said, all right, here's what happened today. There was an assassination plot, and there was this guy who saved you from being assassinated. Remember those two guys who wanted to kill you? He was like, oh, yeah, I do remember that. What's that guy's name? He's like, Mordecai. Mordecai? I don't know. He's like, what did we do to honor him? He saved our lives. I don't think we did anything. And his servants are like, well, there's nothing in the newspaper about what we did for him. And right at that moment, the sun is rising. He hasn't been able to sleep all night. And Haman, you hear his footsteps walking into the room. And Haman goes up to Xerxes, and Xerxes says, hey, wait. Important business. Business can wait. I just heard about this story that somebody saved me. Haman, what do we do? What do we do to the person who saved the king? And Haman's thinking, that's me. I'm going to exterminate the Jews, and I'm responsible for saving the king. And Haman goes, you know what we should do? We should throw that person a parade throughout the entire city. And Xerxes is like, great, let's do it. Go find him. Haman's like, find who? I don't know, there's this dude named Mordecai. He saved me. Go throw him a parade. Can you imagine Haman? So Haman's out throwing Mordecai a parade in the city, and then Esther shows up. And Esther says, Haman just left. Let me tell you about what Haman is doing behind the scenes. He's planning to exterminate all the Jews. And so she's like, what do you mean? Like all the Jews? She's like, yeah, why would I care about that? And finally, he never knew she was Jewish. She says, I'm a Hebrew. I'm Jewish. He's going to kill me. Mordecai's like my dad. And Xerxes said, no, that can't happen. He's been doing all of that behind my back. Long story short, on the 13th day of Adar, when they had rolled the dice, Haman is killed on the same pole meant for Mordecai. And an edict goes out from Xerxes that saves and declares freedom for Jews throughout the land. Merry Christmas. Here's my question. Who saved Christmas? Who saved Christmas? One of the most important and fascinating details to understanding this story is understanding that the book of Esther never mentions God. It's such a glaring detail that is missed. Like there's no prophetic dreams. It reads more like a newspaper, like a history book to the story of Esther, and has left people puzzled for a while when they read the Bible. Like, why is the story of Esther in the Bible? There's no like revelation from God, but it's such a glaring detail that's missing. It's not God making a mistake. It's God making a big, fat point. And it's pointing to something in your life, and it's pointing to something in my life, and it has everything to do with Christmas. See, because God's journey to Christmas, we've been talking about this, it's a doorway, right? Jesus came at Christmas, but the Christmas story is a doorway into understanding who God is and what his plan is for your life and from our life. And Christmas, what I want to talk about today, is the doorway to God's sovereign plan. God's sovereign plan. What is God's sovereignty? I think we hear that word a lot. You've probably heard it in church, but let me break it down for you. What is God's sovereignty? Sovereignty, just as a word, means absolute control and authority over everything. That's what sovereignty is. And theologians love to debate just how sovereign God is, and I'm not going to do that today. You can look up and read about a bunch of stuff and come up with your own conclusions. But let me tell you kind of where I stand, because here's where the Bible does teach clarity on this, is that the plan of God always exists. It's held in tension between God's sovereignty and people's free will. That God has control over everything going on in the story, and people have control of free will, right? If God doesn't have control of everything, then we're still searching for God. You're telling me everything that's happened in your life is random? You're telling me everything that's happened in this story just to get to Christmas is a random coincidence? I think it's God with a plan. But then do humans have any free will? You better bet. Or else who's responsible for things like sin? That would make God the author of sin, and God is not the author of evil. He gives us free will. You want to understand that the sovereignty of God and his plan in the world is always held in tension between our responsibility and God's complete sovereignty and control over everything. And I think we see it so clearly in the story of Esther, where it seems like God is missing, but God has an unstoppable plan, doesn't he? And it shows us how that's accomplished. and how we can actually live that out and experience it in our lives. Let me just make it really clear. God's unstoppable plan from the very beginning, the proto-evangelium, was to send a Savior through the front door of earth that would walk in human flesh to take the sting of death on the cross, but he would rise again because it was only a bruise, and he would stomp on and crush the head of Satan. But at a lot of points, I'll be honest, it seemed like God had taken, that Satan had taken the front door and just slammed it in the face of God. I'm going to exterminate all the Jews here and here and here, and I'm going to make it so you can never get to Christmas, and slam the door. Yet God used every detail. God used every little decision to keep the doorway to salvation open at Christmas. Isn't that just amazing? I mean, every detail. Look at what the Bible says in Proverbs 16. It says, the lot is cast into the lap. Right? You roll some dice, but it's every decision is from the Lord. Literally, Haman rolls dice, says, let's exterminate him on this day. And God says, yeah, little detail. I don't see extermination. I see freedom. An edict is going to go out on that day, and I will use it for my glory. Everything that God does is purposed for our good and for his glory. Do you realize what that means for Christmas? Christmas isn't random. Christmas isn't just this like random holiday we separate and like, whoo, man, glad God made it through all that stuff. Like he got pretty lucky, didn't he? No, Christmas was a sovereign decision of God. He came from heaven to earth for a very clear purpose. Look at what Jesus said when he showed up in John 10. He said, no one takes my life from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down. I have authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father. But here's the thing, lean in, look at me. God has a sovereign plan. And this plan at Christmas, it was always hidden. It was always behind the scenes for people. Now we know about it because you got to realize we're 2,000 years removed. You've celebrated a few Christmases in your life probably, and you're just like, oh yeah, I know that, and Jesus on the cross and the resurrection and stuff, but here's what the Bible says, 1 Corinthians. It says, we declare God's wisdom, a mystery that has been what? Hidden. Say it with me. It's been hidden, and that God destined for our glory before time began. Let that just blow your mind this morning. None of the rulers of this age understood it, for if they had, they wouldn't have crucified the Lord of glory. Look, if everybody understood what God was up to, no one would have crucified them. They would have been like, well, that's God. We're not going to kill Jesus. Instead, Jesus was crucified at the hands of the people he came to save. I mean, looking back on it, we can see it, but the Bible rightfully humbles the people God came to save by saying it was hidden and you didn't see it coming. You couldn't see Christmas coming, but I had it coming from eternity past. God used every detail to come at Christmas through the front door from heaven to earth. You realize what this means for your life? When you think about what is God's plan, what does it mean for me? Why does God feel like he's missing so much in my life? Especially when you're far from home and when you're in some situations that do not feel good and feels like God's been absent, do you know what that means? It means God might be hidden, but God is not absent. He's hiding, but he's not absent. Your life might feel out of control, but God's still in control. It might feel like God is hidden, but his plan is still happening in our world and in your life. And I think the way God works in our life is not always in these really clear, right in front of your face miracles and moments, but he's working in these hidden ways. Think about Esther. He works through a beauty pageant. He works through an overheard conversation, unrewarded obedience, a sleepless night, an old newspaper. And looking back on it, we can see like, oh yeah, God was there the whole time. Here's the challenge is when you're in the middle of it. When you're in the middle of this story and you're like, where in the world is God? I am stuck in Persia and nothing is going my way. I mean, why does God hide himself? If that's how God works, if we see that throughout the Bible, if we see it throughout Christmas, why does God do that? Remember, Christmas is a doorway. And when God sent Jesus to come to earth, He didn't just come to be a miracle worker or a really good teacher, even though he did those things. He came to die, to give his life as a ransom for many, so that we could step into new life through a relationship with Jesus. And not just live apart from him. He says, this is perfect. I want you in a relationship with me now. And this relationship is going to be based on love, and love is always based on trust. That's why Jesus looks for people who are seeking him. Jesus would teach in like riddles and parables. They're confusing. We're still unpacking them today. Because he's looking for people who say, I want to know you. I want to know this God who has sought me out by seeking him myself. And isn't that what love is? I mean, Jesus wants our heart's affections. We've been talking about Christmas isn't throwing Jesus a birthday party. Christmas is about bringing our hearts to a God who's wild and crazy about us and having our heart lit on fire with affection for the Lord. Listen to me, God doesn't need you to know everything to have your heart's affection. In fact, isn't it a stronger place of love when we can look at Jesus and say, I still love you even if I have no idea what you're doing, but I still love you. And it's drawing me into a deeper place of love. And I think this is one of the hardest parts about following Jesus. Can we just all get on the same page about this? This is one of the most challenging parts about following Jesus. I find people don't have a problem maybe getting on board with the fact that there is a sovereign plan of God and that plan extends to their life. The challenge is actually walking it out when you can't see it and when you have no idea what God is doing. That's when the rubber meets the road in Christianity. And I want to help us today. That's our mission as a church. We're here to love God. We want to help people follow Jesus. And I just want to give you a few things that might help you in your relationship with him as we kind of center in on Christmas. You guys with me? How do you do that practically? I think the first thing is you've got to see life through the lens of God's sovereignty. You got to see life through the lens of God's sovereignty. I wear glasses. Any glasses wearers with me in the house today? Come on, Four Eyes. I love you. You love me. I look at the world through my glasses. Most of the time, I don't even realize that they're on. This is just the filter through which I view the world. Life happens, and I view it through this. I think as far as a Jesus, oftentimes, especially the place where we start when we start following Jesus, is we look at God's sovereignty through the lens of our situation, where we look at what's going on in front of us and we say, because I see genocide in front of me and death and end, God, where are you? Like, what's going on? You're totally missing. How could you possibly let this happen? We look at the situation of like a cross, like the disciples did, and oh my gosh, look at the cross. Jesus died. There's no way he's ever coming back to life. God, where are you? Why are you missing? What are you doing? Why are you so quiet between Good Friday and Easter? We look at our situation, and then we judge the sovereignty of God. But I think this is such an invitation. If you want to grow deeper in your faith and walk with Jesus, you got to start to change your prescription. You've got to look at your situation through the sovereignty of God. You've got to look at what's going on in your life through the unstoppable plan of God. So that when you see genocide in front of you, you would say, nope, I see a proclamation of freedom. When you see the cross, you say, nope, I see an empty tomb. That's what my Father sees. When you see these mundane things of your faith right in front of you, right, reading my Bible every day, journaling, doing the right thing. Oh man, the newspaper article didn't get published on the day where I got honored. It's saying, no, I bet God's up to something. I bet he's going to drop that news story at a better time. I believe he's going to drop the news story of what I deserve in my life in a place where he's going to get the most glory and I'm going to get the most good. I'm going to trust in the sovereignty of God. That's what the kind of prescription we got to have in life. I think it's a question that doesn't just ask, God, where are you? Because I just want to say, if you've asked that, that doesn't mean you're bad or anything like that. There's no shame here. I'm coming to you with grace. I want to help you walk in maturity and fullness in Christ. But it's learning not to ask, where is God? It's asking God, what are you up to? Not where is God, but God, what are you up to? Do you realize if this story is true, which it is, if Christmas is true, which it is, that means when things are going the worst in your life, God is actually the most at work for your good. Even though that's the part we want to give up. and we're like, oh, I'm throwing in the towel on Jesus. It didn't work again. I know all those other things happened in my life, and those couldn't be a coincidence, but I'm giving up now. That's actually the moment where God is most at work for your good. Come on, I'm here to encourage somebody. See your situation through the sovereignty of God. Christmas happened. You can bet your life on it. Let me ask you again, who saved Christmas? God did. But he used people in the process. God's sovereignty, human responsibility. There we see it is. And I think God is still calling people to be part of his plan in the world today. Don't you believe it? I still believe he's calling a church called Miracle City to be part of his sovereign plan in a place like Loring Park, in a city like Minneapolis, where we would say, I'm going to wear a different prescription. I'm choosing to buy into God's narrative for my city and God's narrative for my church. That means you got to, this is hard. I'm with you. You got to surrender to the sovereignty of God. It's like what Mordecai told Esther. It's like, Esther, if you don't actually surrender your life to this plan, God's going to do it. He said it in Genesis 3:15. He said he's returning back. There's not just one Christmas, there's two. Church, we've got to surrender to the sovereignty of God. He's going to do it. I don't want you to miss out on what he's doing. Now, hear me clearly, because I just got to say this, because in our culture, in our day and age, like, I know that people have abused this theology. And I'm not saying that the sovereign plan of God is sin, and I'm not saying that the sovereign plan of God is abuse, and that, well, if God knew about it, then everything's fine. No, in Jesus' name, no, that's not how this works. What I am saying is the spirit in the heart of Esther that says, God might not have caused this to happen, but he can sure use it. God may not have caused that part of my story, but I can surrender my story into the hands of a Savior who's never done right in his story through me. What does it mean to surrender? Surrender literally means give up. Wave the white flag. And part of following Jesus, that Jesus said, is pick up your cross and follow me. Wave the white flag on the plan for your life and step into the fullness of my unstoppable plan in the world and for your life. Esther had no idea if it was going to work. She just surrendered to a God who was always working. And let me take it one step further. Do you realize, come on, let Christmas stir you. Do you realize that the most anointed and favored people in the Bible all found themselves far from home in really undesirable places, wondering where in the world is God, and the only solution was to surrender to the sovereignty and to trust him. I mean, Joseph trusted God as he got sold into slavery by his brothers, thrown into prison, and yet he brought those brothers back together, and the 12 tribes of Israel began. Ruth, Boaz, trusted God. Even though it looked like it's just going to end at forgiveness, nope. God wrote a story of redemption. And she became the great-great-great-great-great-grandmother of the Messiah. Should I keep going? Okay. Daniel, in a pit with lions, trusted God, surrendered his life over, and became a witness that would lead the people through one of the most challenging times in Babylon. Elijah, on death row with Jezebel, surrendered and trusted God, and fire fell from heaven as he turned the people away from idols and back to the heart of the Father. David, hiding in a cave from Saul, trusted God, surrendered that it was God's timing and not his, and God anointed him to be king over the whole nation of Israel in the line of the Messiah. Oh yeah, Jesus. Jesus, who surrendered to death so that you and I could have life. Come on, let me just encourage you. If you're in a tough place, give God some praise this morning. I know if you're in a tough place, if you're like, man, life has not turned out like I thought it would, God feels missing right now, come on, look at me. You're not just in good company. You're in the presence of the heroes of the faith, and you might not be responsible for this part of your story, but you can surrender it. You can surrender it over the hands of a God who's never finished writing his story through you. And like Esther and Mordecai, you will find that God's plan might take you to some really far away places from home. But God's never far from you. Would you dare to surrender your life to the unstoppable, unseen plan of God?